Welcome to the attic. I will be your madwoman today as we join together to talk about creepy houses and the women losing their minds inside them in Gothic novels. We're going to take a journey from the 1760s all the way up through the 2020s to talk about literature that engages with the figure of the madwoman in the attic. The crazy wife, the woman who gets locked away, who haunts the home because she has lost her mind. Or has she? When I say the phrase madwoman in the attic, there's a chance you think of this book. At least there's a chance if you've done a degree in English literature, you think of this book. The Madwoman in the Attic, the Woman Writer and the 19th Century Literary Imagination by Sandra Gilbert and Susan Gubar. This is a famous book of feminist literary criticism first published in 1979. But far more likely, when I say the phrase madwoman in the attic, you think of the novel that Gilbert and Gubar are referencing in their title. And that novel, of course, is Jane Eyre, written by Charlotte Bronte, first published in 1847, the novel that dares to ask the question, what if the romantic ideal is a man much older than you who's a little bit ugly and likes it when you're mean to him? This is also the book that the madwoman in the attic figure can be traced back to. We're going to talk about this book and a few others that came before and many others that came after in which this madwoman in the attic figure is featured. We're going to dig into all these different iterations of crazy wives locked up in spooky houses. We're going to talk about ways of interpreting these different characters, historical context, analytical perspectives, and what it means for us to join in this ongoing centuries-long conversation about women and madness and literature. And we're going to start with the story of Jane Eyre. This is the point at which I warn you that this video is full of spoilers for every piece of literature referenced. If you don't want to know the details of what happens in a book you haven't read, check the video description for a list of every text referenced or forever hold your peace. Now let's get into Jane Eyre. For about the first half of this book, we are following along a fairly straightforward coming-of-age story. Jane has to make her own way in the world with the options available to her, which are somewhat limited. She's not rich, she's not beautiful, and she's not particularly sweet. We first meet Jane when she is 10 years old, and she's an orphan living in the house of her cruel aunt and her bullying cousins. We follow her experiences leaving that house, going to a school where she first lives as a student and then eventually is able to work as a teacher. And one night when she's around 18 or 19 years old, Jane experiences this lightning strike of inspiration where she realizes that she needs to take control of her life and actively pursue things that she wants. She manages to find a job as a governess where she will be working in a manor home called Thornfield and teaching a young French girl named Adele, who may or may not be the illegitimate daughter of the master of the house. And some time goes by with Jane living and working there before she meets the master of Thornfield, Mr. Rochester. When she does, there's almost immediately a strange connection between them. They understand each other. They're both just a little bit thorny and odd. As more time goes by and Jane and Rochester are spending more time together, Jane begins falling in love with him. But alongside this, she also begins noticing more and more strange things happening. She keeps hearing this unsettling, joyless laughter coming from the upper floors of the house. A guest in the house is violently attacked, and the story of what happened and who did it just doesn't seem to quite add up. Rochester's bed catches fire in the middle of the night, and Jane has to burst in and save him by dousing the flames in water. This is a moment that really builds the connection and the tension between them. They're alone in the middle of the night next to his smoking bed while he stands there dripping wet, holding her hands tightly, staring into her eyes and thanking her for saving his life. But this moment, of course, also is building out the mystery at the margins of Jane's life in Thornfield. How did Rochester's bed catch on fire, and why, after Jane saves him, does he go off into the dark house to take care of something? Jane and Rochester eventually confess their love and get engaged, but things just get even weirder when one night Jane wakes up and sees at the foot of her bed a strange woman standing in her room trying on her wedding veil. Jane describes her as a woman tall and large, with thick and dark hair hanging long down her back. Rochester suggests that this might have been a ghost, but Jane insists that this woman was not pale like a ghost. She was purple. Her lips were swelled and dark. It was a discolored face. It was a savage face. And Rochester does his best to brush this off as he has brushed everything else off, but he can no longer escape the truth coming out when on their wedding day, somebody stands up and objects to their getting married on the basis that Mr. Rochester is already married. This, of course, is the reason for everything strange that has been happening at Thornfield, and this is the reason that we are here. Mr. Rochester is married, his wife has lost her mind, and he has been keeping her locked away in secret. Her name is Bertha, and she is the madwoman in the attic. Now let's walk things back a little bit and really sit with, really contextualize and dig into this phrase, madwoman in the attic. It's like a Negroni, 3 equal parts, each of them important to the whole. We have madness, we have women, and we have the attic. And they're all combined and served up together in a Gothic novel. There's no checklist of characteristics that make something a Gothic novel, and neither are there stable boundaries around what is and isn't included in the genre. But something we see recurring frequently in different iterations across the Gothic is the use of things like supernatural forces, mysteries, or taboos as devices that allow the author to tell a story about a real fear or social issue at a heightened, fictionalized register. Think, for example, about one of the most famous Gothic novels, Frankenstein. It's a story about a patched together, reanimated corpse, yes, but that more extreme, unrealistic element of the reanimated corpse is being used to tell what is a realistic story about the dangers of ambition, about the pain of parental abandonment, about the cascading harm that happens as a result of society's rejection of the visible other. There's always something uncomfortably familiar lying beneath that sensationalized story in the Gothic. We see that with how property features into Gothic novels, and we see that as early as what is considered to be the first Gothic novel, Castle of Otranto, Horace Walpole, 1764. This novel gives us an old spooky castle that is being plagued by ghosts and by supernatural dysfunction and general dysfunction, all resulting from the fact that the family inhabiting it are not the rightful heirs. And the most tragic consequences of this are visited upon the daughter of the family. Her father first tries to force her into an unwanted marriage with a much older man so that he himself can marry a much younger woman, and then eventually accidentally murders her. In the end, the Castle of Otranto collapses into rubble. In this book, yes, we have spooky skeletons and animate portraits and ghosts and curses. But at the core of the story is something much more familiar: the integrity of a home compromised by disrupted inheritance. A patriarchal figure who sees the women around him as tools or as sexual objects, all centered on one piece of property, one house. And across the development of the Gothic genre, property and inheritance and women are consistently foregrounded in the stories being told. Ann Radcliffe's Mysteries of Udolpho, 1794, follows a young woman through 700 pages worth of personal crisis and family tragedy, including her aunt's husband trapping them in a castle in an effort to force them to sign their properties over to him. Another Radcliffe novel, The Italian, 1797. A number of people try to forestall the wedding of 2 young lovers out of a fear that the woman's bloodline and financial situation make her an inappropriate match. In books like these, through talking about marriages, about property, about inheritance, we're talking about the foundations of patriarchy. Primogeniture and tactical alliances through marriages and titles passing from one generation to the next. All these different things that are deeply connected to houses, to property. Who is allowed to possess a house? In her book, Property and Power in English Gothic Literature, Ruth Beanstalk Analick writes about the complexity of parsing all the different versions of possession that we see in Gothic lit. Real estate, human beings, and texts may be legally possessed, commodified as private property through various systems, including property rights, marriage, slavery, and copyright. Concurrently, bodies may also be possessed sexually. Conversely, edifices, bodies, and texts may be imaginatively possessed by haunting ghosts. Sane, self-possessed, and enlightened minds may rationally possess knowledge and perception, yet minds may also be supernaturally possessed by ghosts and by the related dispossessions of madness and hallucinations. We have this whole mess of things. houses possessed by ghosts, women possessed by husbands, readers possessing books, stories possessing the mind. And in the process of attempting to untangle all of these different kinds of possessions, all of these different stories being told, we're worrying away all the while at these ideas of ownership and of property. For the madwoman to be in the attic is not inconsequential. She is in the private reaches of the house, confined to the margins of a property which she possesses like a ghost, but is unable to possess as an owner. Now that we've shaded in a little bit of context around the woman's attic, let's consider her madness. What does it mean for a woman to be called mad in the 18th and 19th centuries when the Gothic novel is first developing? With the other side of that being, what are considered to be the foundations of a woman's sanity in the 18th and 19th centuries? Well, for one thing, a sane woman ought to be balanced, and anything that threatens that balance, that is overstimulating, threatens a woman's health. And the world is rife with all kinds of dangerous forms of overstimulation that may threaten the balance of a woman's delicate little mind. The scholar Ann Radcliffe quotes an English physician who wrote in the year 1829, "Education conducted with too great severity may lead to insanity." And it's not just a too intense education that may threaten the balance of the female mind, but reading in general. As Radcliffe writes, reading was considered as potentially dangerous because it could lead to the overexcitement of the nervous system and eventually become a threat to a woman's gynecological health. Did she just say gynecological health? She did. Yes, she did. There was a perceived link between female anatomy and mental instability. Women's bodies are all unbalanced and excessive and wild, as of course are women's emotions. After all, the word hysteria is derived from the Latin word for womb. Let's tap in another scholarly voice. Anna Klombauer writes, "The possession of female sexual organs alone was seen as a predisposition for madness." That madness, that hysteria in women, was sometimes treated with genital stimulation, sometimes manually, sometimes through water massage, sometimes with vibration devices. What I want to highlight in this is that gender, sexuality, the reading and writing of literature, excessive emotions are all being linked together in discourse surrounding insanity. And what's relevant for our purposes here is not the history of mental illness, the details of diagnosis and treatment. I'm not going to be trying to apply diagnoses to fictional characters, and I'm not going to be trying to figure out exactly what an author's intentions were in any particular representation of or discussion of insanity. What we're talking about is the recurrence of this figure of the mad wife who gets locked away. We're talking about the function of madness in particular stories and across a genre. And looking at these patterns across texts, looking at the historical realities and the discourse surrounding the composition of these pieces of literature helps us understand the context out of which a story emerges. One text where we can see an author really deeply engaging with contemporary ideas about gender and madness is a book called Maria, or the Wrongs of Woman. This novel was unfinished and was published in 1798 following the death of its author, Mary Wollstonecraft, who you may know for also being the author of a text called A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, or for being Mary Shelley's mom. Mary Wollstonecraft was a very controversial figure in her time for things like her defense of a woman's right to education and her critique of marriage as an oppressive institution. And those beliefs of hers are foundational to the story of The Wrongs of Woman. The eponymous character of this novel, Maria, grew up very aware of the fact that her parents loved her brother more than her, and she often escaped from her own house by going to the home of a neighbor, where she fell in love with the son of the house, a man named George. George had always appeared to be kind and loving and respectable, and it's only after they get married that Maria learns the truth of his character. He gambles, he drinks, he sleeps around, and he treats her quite badly. Maria flees from her husband with their child, but he constantly pursues her. Eventually, he catches up with her, and he manages to take her daughter away from her and imprison her in an asylum. He weaponizes the gendered views of insanity against his wife, and in doing so, he is able to strip her of her credibility, of her daughter, and of her autonomy. In order to conduct research for this book, Mary Wollstonecraft visited an operating psychiatric institution to observe the conditions there. She went to Bethlehem Hospital, which you may better recognize by the name Bedlam. This is the most famous, or rather infamous, mental institution in the world. It was founded in the 13th century as the English Royal Hospital and does actually still function today, although it has been reformed. But according to the scholar Lisa Pignanesi, in the 18th century, Bedlam was a chamber of horrors where the Georgian mad were no better treated than chained raving beasts. One of the horrible practices in place at Bethlehem was that people were able to pay to walk through and get a close look at the inmates for entertainment. So Wollstonecraft was able to get an intimate look at what it was like to be imprisoned in an insane asylum. She took these details and she reworked them into fiction to write a story that expresses a fear of patriarchal control, of what some of the most extreme reaches could look like of a man mistreating his wife. And again, our focus here is on the literary. We are looking at stories about madness. But I do want to highlight that this story, Mary Wollstonecraft telling, is a fictional expression of an unfortunately not at all fictional threat. Historical anecdotes of women being stripped of their autonomy through being forcibly and wrongfully imprisoned in insane asylums stretch for at least a century after the publication of Maria or The Wrongs of Women. And there was often public outrage in response to these women having been wrongfully imprisoned, but the fact remains they were wrongfully institutionalized. Lisa Apignese highlights the case of Ursula Roy, who was institutionalized in the 1850s and had to petition for years to be released. She was consistently denied and silenced in her attempts to gain her freedom. Amy Milne Smith showcases a number of women: Rosina Bulwer-Lytton, Georgina Weldon, Louise Lowe, all of whom were wrongfully institutionalized for insanity by their husbands. And with that, let's return to Jane Eyre. So far, I have brought us right up to the threshold of the attic. We've touched on Jane's childhood, her time at Lowood School, her increasing ambitions for a career and a life of her own, her work as a governess, her building relationship with Mr. Rochester. Already at this, we can see how gender and power and ideas about proper behavior are at play within this text. We have a heroine who lives at the margins of wealth and power. She grows up in this large, stately home that is occupied by a family who enjoys a life of luxury. But because Jane's parents married irresponsibly, married across class lines, she is barred from enjoying that life of luxury. Instead, she is treated cruelly by her aunt and by her cousin, the boy who will someday inherit this house that they all live in. Through her experiences in this home and then at Lowood School, which is run by a miserly man who applies expectations of privation onto the girls who live at the school, but never onto his own daughters, who he treats very well, Jane learns that any outburst of anger will be seen by the people around her as an excess of emotion and will only result in things getting worse for her. Whereas Jane has to figure out how to quell her prickly nature, Rochester has no such need. He can express all of his opinions and all of his emotions without fear of disenfranchisement. He can even bring the child Adele, the orphan bastard of a French opera singer, into this world of comfort and security. He controls who has access to the material comforts, to the security and the luxury within Thornfield. He can bring Adele in, he can bring Jane in, he can bring his wife in, and lock her away where no one will ever see her. Let's finally now talk about her. Let's talk about Bertha. It was Bertha, of course, who appeared in Jane's room that night and tried on her wedding veil. It was Bertha who stabbed the visitor to Thornfield. It was her brother who was there to observe her. It was Bertha who set Rochester's bed on fire. It is Bertha's laughter that has been echoing through the halls of Thornfield. Mr. Rochester has been trying to keep the existence of a Mrs. Rochester secret, but on his would-be wedding day to Jane, it all comes out. Rochester brings Jane and a small group of witnesses away from the church, back to Thornfield, up the multiple flights of stairs towards the attic, through one door into a bedroom, and then through another door hidden in the wall behind a tapestry. In a room without a window, there burnt a fire, guarded by a high and strong fender, and a lamp suspended from the ceiling by a chain. In the deep shade at the farther end of the room, a figure ran backwards and forwards. What it was, whether beast or human being, one could not at first sight tell. It groveled, seemingly, on all fours. It snatched and growled like some strange wild animal. But it was covered with clothing, and a quantity of dark grizzled hair, wild as a mane, hid its head and face. She's further described as a clothed hyena, as a maniac. When she sees Rochester, she bellows out, she attacks him. Bertha is nearly the same height as her husband, and she's almost able to beat him in the fight, but finally he manages to restrain her. He ties her to a chair, and then he turns to the onlookers and he says, "That is my wife. Such is the sole conjugal embrace I am ever to know." Once they leave this room, once they leave Bertha tied to a chair in this windowless attic, that's the last time we see her directly on the page. But we're left, of course, with questions, not least of which are, who is this woman, and how did she become mad and in an attic? Our information on who Bertha is comes entirely from the story that Rochester tells to Jane while he's trying to convince her that they can still be together. We learn that Rochester is not the oldest son. He had once an older brother whose responsibility it would be to inherit Thornfield and to run the estate. And it was their father's decision that our Mr. Rochester would not inherit any property and would instead have to marry a wealthy woman. To that end, a match was found for Rochester. It was decided that he would marry the daughter of a wealthy planter and merchant in Jamaica. When Rochester first traveled to Jamaica and met Bertha, he was drawn to her. He was attracted by her warmth, her beauty, her charm, and by the fact that a lot of other young men wanted her too. He talks about being dazzled, stimulated. He calls himself ignorant, raw, and inexperienced. He says, "She allured me. A marriage was achieved almost before I knew where I was." He is characterizing himself in a very particular and a very strategic way here. The language he is using is extremely passive. It's not, "I married her." It's, "a marriage was achieved." He is this helpless, innocent victim to the machinations of this family. And it's only after the marriage takes place that Rochester learns Bertha's mother is not dead, as he believed, but instead is shut up in a lunatic asylum. Turns out that insanity is a family trait, and it was expected, if not considered inevitable, that Bertha herself would someday lose her mind. According to Rochester, after their marriage, Bertha's behavior pretty quickly begins to deteriorate, but it's not clear in his telling which parts of her behavior are a result of insanity. He says that she has outbursts of anger, that she is unchaste, and eventually he says she was declared mad, and he had to lock her away. At this point, Rochester and Bertha were still living in Jamaica, and they continued to live there for years. And in the story he tells Jane, Rochester says that he nearly killed himself one night, but instead he had the idea to return to England. According to Rochester, no one in England knew he was married, and at this point his father and brother were dead, which meant that Thornfield was his, so he was able to sneak the wife that no one knew about into the estate he had inherited. He was able to hire a discreet servant to take care of her, and he was able to enclose her in a windowless room in the attic. When they first arrived in England, Rochester says of Bertha, "She had lucid intervals of days, sometimes weeks, which she filled up with abuse of me." In order to escape his wife being mad at him, Rochester would avoid Thornfield. He avoided Thornfield for 10 years, until finally he decided that he had suffered enough and he deserved the opportunity to get married again. He returned to Thornfield with the intention of finding a woman who would agree to marry him with the full knowledge that Bertha existed. He intended to be upfront with whoever it was he wanted to share his life with. Instead, he met Jane, and he was so afraid of alienating her, of losing her respect and her affection, that he decided to conceal the existence of his wife. But of course, as we saw when he tried to marry her, it all came tumbling down around him. And after 10 years, the truth came out. 10 years of Bertha locked in a windowless room in the attic, only able to sneak out when her attendant is too drunk to stop her. 10 years in which Mrs. Rochester lives in Thornfield, possessing it like a ghost, but not like an owner. This is bumming me the fuck out. Okay. If we trust Rochester's telling of events, he was essentially tricked into a marriage under false pretenses in order to get him to become the caretaker for a woman who he quickly realized he had nothing in common with, did not like at all, didn't even really know. Some people will make a case for reading Rochester sympathetically in his treatment of Bertha. They will say that because institutions like Bethlehem Hospital were so inhumane, that he is keeping her from a worse fate by keeping her contained within Thornfield. And I'll grant you that life in a horrible asylum would have been worse, but there were also more options at hand. The choice was not between Bethlehem Hospital and lock her in an attic for a decade. Take, for example, the case of Mary Lamb, who co-authored with her brother, Charles Lamb, a collection of children's versions of Shakespeare's plays. Mary and Charles Lamb were friends with people like William Wordsworth, Samuel Taylor Coleridge. They were very involved in the whole English literary set of their time. In 1796, several years before she and her brother published that collection of children's versions of Shakespeare plays, Mary experienced some kind of mental breakdown. It's hard to know the exact details of what was going on in her body or in her brain, but it was a severe episode of breakdown, the tragic result of which was that Mary murdered her mother. And in the subsequent trial around this murder, she was legally declared to be a lunatic. And from then until her death in 1847, the same year Jane Eyre was published, Mary was given what was considered to be the necessary care, closely overseen by her brother Charles. There were times when Mary would be institutionalized if she was going through a period of breakdown that required more support, but she wasn't being institutionalized at places like Bethlehem. There were private hospitals for the insane that had much, much higher standards of comfort and care. Outside of those limited periods of time, she was able to live a full life. She was able to write. She was able to maintain friendships. She was able to be free. This kind of approach to treating insanity was an option for Rochester. If he had any kind of personal care for his wife, he could have arranged that type of care for her. In fact, there's one brief moment, far too brief, unfortunately, where Jane stands up for Bertha and she says, "It is cruel. She cannot help being mad." And to this, Rochester responds, "It is not because she is mad I hate her. If you were mad, do you think I should hate you?" Jane says, "Yes, I absolutely do. I think if I went insane, you would definitely hate me and mistreat me." But Rochester insists that he wouldn't. He insists that because he loves Jane so much, if she were to go insane, he would care for her constantly, and she would spend the rest of her life imprisoned by nothing but his arms around her. Caring for someone through their insanity is an option Rochester knows exists. It's just one he won't extend to his wife. He hates her. He is viciously contemptuous with every word he speaks about Bertha, especially now that he has one more reason to resent her. She's keeping him from marrying Jane. And this is the most obvious function that Bertha serves within the story. She is an obstacle to Jane and Rochester's relationship. Rochester cannot legally divorce Bertha, and Jane refuses to become the mistress to a married man. There is no path forward for their relationship. This is definitely a digression, but a little while ago, I was watching Downton Abbey because it reminds me of my grandma, and there is a storyline that I didn't remember from whenever I had previously watched it, in which the middle daughter of the central family, whose name is Edith, falls in love with a man who she learns is married, but to a woman who has gone insane. But the laws in 1910s England, just like the laws in 1840s England, don't allow this man any recourse for divorce. This man is legally tied to a person who he doesn't recognize anymore, and he is unable to get married to the woman who he does want to have a future with. This is Jane and Rochester and Bertha all over again. And in this case, the Rochester figure does actually tell the Jane figure about the existence of the Bertha figure. He gives the woman he loves an opportunity to make an informed decision. But as in Jane Eyre, the insane wife is not given a fully developed identity. The story doesn't care and doesn't direct us to care about the madwoman herself. The story cares and directs us to care about how the madwoman's existence interrupts the relationship of two people. The insane first wife is just an obstacle to a couple's happiness. And that's it. That's all she is. That's all the significance of the Mad Wife is. We did it. We got to the bottom of it. End of video. She was in the house still. She was in that room in the West Wing. She was in the library, in the morning room, in the gallery above the hall. Her footsteps sounded in the corridors. Her scent lingered on the stairs. To Jane and to Mr. Rochester, Bertha might just be the thing that keeps them apart. But to us, as readers, we definitely have more to talk about. As I've mentioned, we only get information about Bertha from the brief glimpses Jane has of her and from the biased story Rochester tells about her. In terms of how we as readers then approach our interpretation and analysis, we have to do a little bit of reading between the lines. We have to look at what we do know and use that to consider what might be being left unsaid. We know that Bertha was born in Jamaica. We know that her mother is described as being a Creole woman. We know that Jane describes Bertha as having swollen lips, coarse hair, a savage face, and the behavior of an animal. Are these just descriptions of the exaggeratedly disheveled appearance of a woman who has gone insane? Or are these perhaps also the descriptions of a woman who is not white? This isn't a straightforward question for us to answer, in part because ideas about race and racist ideas are expressed differently in 1840s England than we might be used to today. For example, when Rochester is describing how the marriage was achieved, he says, "Her family wished to secure me because I was of a good race." To a 21st century reader, that might sound like him saying, they wanted me to marry into this family because I was white, with the potential implication further being, and they weren't. But we don't even have to go outside this novel to see that at the time this was written, the word race was not always used to describe ethnicity. Early in the novel, when Jane is a child and she is being mistreated by her aunt, Mrs. Reed, who is her aunt not by blood, but through marriage, Jane speaks of Mrs. Reed's dislike of her and says, how could she really like an interloper, not of her race, and unconnected with her after her husband's death? Mr. Rochester could very well be referring to his being from a good English family, not to his being white, when he says that his race was an incentive for the marriage. Bertha's identity as the daughter of a Creole woman is another point of ambiguity here. Creole was a word used to describe people born in colonized places like Jamaica, and it could be applied to somebody of any racial background. Somebody who was black, somebody who was mixed race, even somebody who was white and born of English ancestry, but in Jamaica. Jane's narration gives us descriptions of Bertha's appearance that feel pretty explicitly racist, and I think are informed by racism regardless of Bertha's ancestry, but Rochester gives us a description of Bertha in which he compares her in appearance to Blanche Ingram, another character in the novel who is unambiguously a white English woman. Ultimately, even if you interpret Bertha as a white woman born in Jamaica, it's that last point, born in Jamaica, that makes the colonial context undeniable. Bertha is an outsider, she is an other, and the other characters repeatedly associate her with things like heat, drunkenness, aggression, and excessive sexuality. This is the woman who is locked away in the private spaces of Thornfield. This is the woman Rochester is stuck with as a wife, as opposed to the woman he wants as a wife, Jane, who he repeatedly describes as being kind of an elfin creature who reminds him of a mythical prehistoric England. I think any complete consideration of the figure of the madwoman in the attic has to include consideration of the fact that Thornfield, as the English estate, is haunted not just by the despised and dehumanized wife, but by this woman who is a reminder of English colonial instability and violence. And this brings us to another novel, this one written over a century after Jane Eyre was published, which problematizes the madwoman in the attic figure by foregrounding that colonial context. Wide Sargasso Sea by Jean Rhys, published 1966. In this novel, Rhys, who was herself a white Creole woman born in Dominica, gives Bertha a backstory, gives her a voice, foregrounds her identity as a Creole woman and challenges the story Rochester has told about her, including, is this madwoman even mad? Yes, Mr. Rochester tells us that Bertha has gone insane, but if the cruel husband from Maria or The Wrongs of Women were trying to convince his 19-year-old employee to be his mistress, wouldn't he have a similar story to tell? In Wide Sargasso Sea, Bertha Antoinetta Mason Rochester is reimagined as Antoinette. As in Jane Eyre, we meet our main character when she is a young girl and we follow her journey into adulthood. Antoinette's family were planters who lost everything due to the abolition of slavery. Their house burns down, her intellectually disabled brother dies, and her mother's grief intensifies into a break with reality. And Antoinette occupies a kind of social no man's land. She and her family are rejected by the Black people around them, who they have grievously harmed, but they're also rejected by the white English people who don't see them as the same. And of course, being familiar with the story Mr. Rochester tells in Jane Eyre, we know where this is going to lead. Antoinette is going to marry an English man named Mr. Rochester, and their marriage is going to very quickly deteriorate. But in Rhys's retelling, we get much more detail and we get a different version of Rochester. And we even get some parts of this novel that are told through Rochester's perspective. He is attracted to his wife, but in an ultimately demeaning, hypersexualized way. While Antoinette is beginning to fall in love with him, he is becoming increasingly cruel to her. And when she tries to use a love potion to win his affections back, it makes him severely ill, and he becomes convinced that she's tried to murder him. Following this, Rochester will only see Antoinette as a mad woman. Every action of hers, every emotion she expresses, everything she does and everything she is, he reframes as proof of her insanity. He hates how different she is from him and how remote she feels from him. So he decides to give her a new name, a more English name. He renames her Bertha. One woman who has known Antoinette since her childhood tries to intervene on her behalf and asks Rochester to just leave Antoinette alone, to just go back to England since he's so miserable in this place and in this marriage. And in doing so, let both of them be free of this marriage and to leave open the possibility that maybe Antoinette could find happiness someday, including possibly finding love with someone else someday. But Rochester refuses, and in response he says, "She's mad, but mine." And as we knew would happen, he returns to England with Antoinette with him. He brings her to Thornfield and he locks her in the attic. Despite his claims, Antoinette is not insane when he brings her to Thornfield. She is not locked up because she's lost her mind. She loses her mind because she is locked up. It's the decade of confinement, the isolation, the gradual loss of her sense of time and of her identity that causes an eventual mental deterioration. She begins to dream of the house burning down, and the novel ends with her walking out of the attic holding a lit candle. Rhys is rejecting the figure Bronte has created of an animalistic madwoman too insane to be counted as a full person, relevant only insofar as she interrupts the relationship of the people who should be together. Instead of the raving lunatic Bertha, we have Antoinette. Bertha only bellows and laughs, but Antoinette has interiority, she has motivations, she has a voice. Her madness is built out into trauma, and Rochester's hatred is built out into extreme cruelty. As much as he hates her, he is also determined to possess her and to control her. The madwoman is his property just as much as the attic is. Here, I want to pause with that idea for a minute. The madwoman as property, a wife as a possession of her husband's. It is accurate to say that under a patriarchal system, and especially a system of marriage that seeks to limit opportunities for women to independently own or inherit property, to pursue careers and education, and to obtain divorce, among many other things, that women are being treated as commodities. Money, land, homes, and women are passed from one man to another through legal contracts. And sometimes a woman is just the means through which the money, home, or land is passed from one man to the other. This gets us back to some of the things we were talking about in regards to 18th century Gothic novels, right? Women being treated either as sexual objects or as tools. Marriage is a way for men to control how money and property are passed around. This gets us back to Mary Wollstonecraft too, this time to her 1792 text, A Vindication of the Rights of Women, in which you don't have to go any farther than the introduction to find a passage in which Wollstonecraft compares the conditions of women to the conditions of slaves. A comparison which she goes on to repeat at several points. In fiction, too, it's common to see the language of slavery used to describe the mistreatment of English women. Jane Eyre positions herself as a rebel slave at several points in the novel. In the novel The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, which was written by the youngest Bronte sister, Anne, there is a character who is an abused wife, desperate to escape, but trapped by the conditions of her marriage, and she at multiple points compares her life to that of a slave. Let's go back for a moment into the Analect text, Property and Power in English Gothic Literature. Analect says of writers like Mary Wollstonecraft who make this comparison between English women and the enslaved that a solipsism of sorts presupposes this conflation. Comparing the lot of the English wife to that of slaves comes dangerously close to minimizing the situation of the slave. These writers displaced anxieties about their own assumed powerlessness and inferiority onto their representations of slaves without actually considering the subjective experience of the slaves. She says, comes dangerously close to minimizing the situation of the slave. I say, definitely it minimizes, and it's important that we don't continue that minimization today. In an episode about Jane Eyre in the on-air series of the Hot and Bothered podcast, the scholar Lisa Woolfolk addresses Jane's euphemistic use of the language of slavery, and Woolfolk says, euphemism is violence. To use language of enslavement, to refer to oneself as a slave, just as a turn of phrase meant to act as a shorthand to convey the experience of being mistreated and controlled and dispossessed, is to deflect away from the reality of slavery. Jane really is being mistreated, and the woman in Tenant of Wildfell Hall really is being controlled. But when the abused wife in Wildfell Hall runs away from the situation in which she is being controlled and mistreated, she does so with a servant at her side in order to go take refuge in an ancestral home. This is not slavery. Jane is pursuing a career. She has opportunities for upward mobility. She has the option to speak her mind and stand up against figures of authority. And when she does so, yes, she has to fear retaliation. Sometimes she even has to fear physical violence. But as she repeatedly reminds us and Mr. Rochester, she is free. She can make the choice at any time to leave a situation that she doesn't want to be in. And that's exactly what she does after Rochester has finished telling her his story. She tells him that she is leaving. He begs her not to. He says he has a whitewashed villa on the shores of the Mediterranean and that they can go live there as husband and wife without hurting anybody. There have been so many times that I read that part and I think, girl, go live in the south of France with the man you love in a whitewashed villa. Are you kidding me? You know, just like how when we were watching the most recent season of Bridgerton, there were some of us who saw Benedict ask Sophie to be his mistress and were outraged. And then there were others of us who thought that's a very reasonable proposition, and if you negotiate the terms correctly, this could turn out pretty well for you. In this moment, Jane and Rochester are both being harmed by the systems of marriage. According to Rochester, he realized he and Bertha were incompatible before she had ever gone insane, and it is wrong that two people who don't want to be married should be trapped in a marriage together. But of course, the harm of this patriarchal system, this marriage system that they're trapped within, isn't equal, and the risk isn't equal. And Jane is right that she stands to lose a lot if she becomes Rochester's mistress and things don't work out. Rochester does his absolute best to convince Jane to stay with him, but she refuses him. She is too stubborn even for his persuasion to work. This is part of what makes Jane such a distinctive character. She is so frequently stubborn and so often rebellious. After all, the entire novel begins with Jane's first act of resistance, the moment when she is 10 years old and for the first time she stands up for herself against her bullying cousins. And while, as I've said, as a young girl, she does learn that it will be to her benefit to figure out how to control the outward expression of her emotions somewhat, this doesn't change the inward intensity with which she experiences these feelings of rebellion, not just against the treatment she receives from some individuals, but against the conditions of her life. In her early days at Thornfield, before she's even met Mr. Rochester, Jane feels herself internally rebelling against what she feels is the oppressive tranquility of her life. She looks out at the world around her and she feels restless. And reflecting on this, she says, "Nobody knows how many rebellions, besides political rebellions, ferment in the masses of life which people earth. Women are supposed to be very calm generally, but women feel just as men feel. They need exercise for their faculties and a field for their efforts as much as their brothers do. They suffer from too rigid a restraint, too absolute a stagnation, precisely as men would suffer, and it is narrow-minded in their more privileged fellow creatures to say that they ought to confine themselves to making puddings and knitting stockings, to playing on the piano and embroidering bags. It is thoughtless to condemn them or laugh at them if they seek to do more or learn more than custom has pronounced necessary for their sex." Custom and that doctor in the 1820s who thought that reading might drive a woman insane. Jane rebels against these social conventions in the same way that she rebelled against her cousin and the same way that she is now rebelling against Rochester and even against herself. She refuses to be his mistress in spite of how much she loves him and in spite of how desperately hard he's trying to convince her. And his desperation gets to the point of near violence. He physically grabs her. And he has this outburst in which he is saying that he knows he's so much bigger and stronger than her that he could physically overpower her and force her to stay in Thornfield. But he says within the cage of her body, there is an unbreakable spirit that he cannot get to. "Whatever I do with its cage, I cannot get at it, the savage, beautiful creature. If I tear, if I rend the slight prison, my outrage will only let the captive loose. Conqueror I may be of the house, Jane's body, but the inmate would escape to heaven before I could call myself possessor of its clay dwelling place. And it is you, spirit, with will and energy and virtue and purity that I want, not alone your brittle frame." He's kind of contemplating here what would happen if he murdered her. But he's saying that there's something about her that cannot be controlled. He cannot do to Jane what he has done to Bertha. Bertha he can overpower and cage, but Jane he cannot. In the passage I just read out from a moment ago, in which Jane is looking out at her surroundings and feeling her spirit rebel against the quiet oppression of her life, I left out one detail. I didn't read the part that identifies where Jane physically is when she is having these thoughts of rebellion and reflecting on how women want more than is allowed for them. She says that these thoughts come to her when I climbed the 3 staircases, raised the trapdoor of the attic, and having reached the leads, looked out afar over sequestered field and hill and along dim skyline. She's up there by the attic, pacing back and forth, looking out at that which surrounds her and wanting more, not realizing at this point that Bertha is just a wall and a hidden door away, pacing back and forth in her room. Jane and Bertha are in tension with each other, and in some ways they mirror each other. We meet Jane when she is 10 years old, and we meet Bertha in her 10th year of imprisonment. Jane and Bertha are the 2 Mrs. Rochesters, both pacing back and forth in the upper limits of Thornfield, both trapped by patriarchy and both in their own way rebelling. In The Madwoman in the Attic, Gilbert and Gubar talk about Bertha as Jane's double. To their reading, Bertha's actions reflect Jane's innermost desires. Bertha is able to enact those rebellious, disorderly impulses that Jane has learned to push down. When they are first getting to know each other, Rochester tells Jane some of the details of his relationship with his late mistress. He is breaking the rules of decorum. He is being unconventionally frank and intimate with her. Jane is grateful for this, and in reflecting back on it, starts having her first real thoughts of love for Rochester. And that night, after Jane is having feelings of love for this man who has told her details of his sexual past, Bertha sets Rochester's bed on fire. When they are preparing to get married, Jane hates the fancy clothes that Rochester has bought for her. Bertha sneaks into Jane's room and rips her wedding veil in half. Jane wishes that she were equal to Rochester in size and strength. Bertha is, so much so that she can almost beat Rochester in a physical fight. In each of these moments, something that Jane feels is externalized through Bertha's actions. And when Jane has learned of the existence of Bertha, when she learns that the man she loves has an insane wife locked away in her attic, and this man is now trying to convince Jane to run away with him and be his mistress, Jane is seriously considering it. And she has to remind herself, laws and principles are not for the times when there is no temptation. They are for such moments as this, when the body and soul rise in mutiny against their rigor. Stringent they are, inviolate they shall be. If at my individual convenience I might break them, what would be their worth? They have a worth, so I have always believed, and if I cannot believe it now, it is because I am insane, quite insane, with my veins running fire, and my heart beating faster than I can count its throbs. If Jane stays with Rochester, she thinks, she will have become insane. Rochester already has an insane wife in the attic. Jane doesn't want to become the insane mistress in the villa. So she decides to leave, even though that decision feels to her like she is plucking out her own eye and cutting off her own hand. Ironically enough, when at the end of the book, Bertha sets fire to Thornfield in what ends up being either an accidental or intentional self-immolation, Rochester will lose one eye and one hand in his attempt to save Bertha. Because, of course, that's how it all ends. Thornfield burns, Bertha dies, Rochester is left disabled and humbled. Jane, meanwhile, has been living with some long-lost cousins, and she inherited some money, and she returns to Thornfield on a premonition that something has happened to Rochester, and they reconcile, and reader, I married him, and so on and so on. We're not here to talk about their relationship or their happy ending. We're here to talk about the madwoman, about Bertha, whose final act is to burn her prison to the ground, to take the estate that has been enriched by her money, in which she has been trapped while her husband tries to fuck the governess, and destroy it. Bertha, like Jane, is rebelling against the conditions that have been forced upon her. Gilbert and Gubar's reading of Bertha as Jane's double is at some points a compelling one and in some ways a flawed one. And one of the main problems that I and other people have with this reading is that it entirely focuses on Jane's subjectivity with no real consideration of Bertha having agency. In a critique of Gilbert and Gubar's reading, Rose Commell writes that they fail to consider the likelihood that Bertha's mirthless laugh and arsonist proclivity stem from historical powerlessness to articulate a narrative told secondhand by Jane, Rochester, and even the innkeeper who witnesses her death in the fire. Sometimes it feels like even Charlotte Bronte failed to consider Bertha as a tragic and rebellious figure trying to gain some small amount of agency, even if it only comes in the form of self-immolation. Sometimes it takes a later reader like Jean Rhys to take one detail, one character from a rich text, and expand it out into greater detail. Add another voice to an ongoing conversation. And now our conversation about unbalanced behavior and houses and first wives and older men with dubious morality is going to bring us to another 20th century novel that engages with the story of Jane Eyre. It's time to talk about Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. Gilbert and Gubar describe Jane Eyre as Pamela's daughter and Rebecca's aunt. I'm not sure I entirely agree with that. I might say that Jane is Pamela's niece. Maybe that's just because I'm trying to distance them because I hate Pamela with a burning, fiery passion that I don't have time to talk about in this video. But I appreciate the literary lineage that they're drawing, and absolutely Rebecca is a descendant of Jane Eyre. As with Jane Eyre, this novel, which was published in 1938, gives us a young woman with very little social power in a relationship with an older, wealthy man who comes as a package deal with a very nice house in the English countryside, which house is deeply marked by the kind of present absence of his first wife. Rebecca is not the name of that young woman. That young woman, our main character, has no name. We only know her by the title Mrs. De Winter, which she gets about 70 pages into the book when she marries Maxim de Winter. Rebecca is the name of Maxim's first wife. She is the first Mrs. De Winter, and she died about a year before our unnamed narrator met and married Maxim. Our parallels between Jane Eyre and this book begin with the fact that our unnamed narrator is an orphan with no real friends or family. When she meets Maxim, who, like Rochester, is much older and wealthier and a little bit mysterious, she is working as a paid companion to an older woman, and his proposal of marriage is very practical. Basically, he says, you can keep doing the kind of paid companion work that you're doing with this woman, or you can marry me and be doing essentially the same thing, but as my wife and mistress of Manderley. If you marry me, you get a house in the bargain. And she really wants the house. In fact, when she was a child, she bought a picture postcard of this house, and she has ever since always had an image of it in her mind as this beautiful old English estate. So unlike Jane Eyre, the marriage happens at the beginning of this book rather than at the end, but the marriage is framed as a kind of employment, which does further the parallel between this narrator and Jane Eyre. And similar to how Thornfield is being haunted by the presence of Rochester's first wife, Bertha, Manderley is very much haunted by the presence of Maxim's first wife, Rebecca. The clear difference being that Rebecca is not alive, is not secretly locked in some far room of the house. She is dead. But increasingly, as the narrator is living in Manderley and trying to make it her home, she is aware, painfully aware, of how present Rebecca still is in the house. Bertha's laughter echoes through the hall, and her anger threatens to burn the house down. Rebecca's character and her legacy is alive in every floral arrangement, in every meal served, in every conversation the narrator has with her new neighbors and in-laws. Bertha, in her life, prevents Jane and Rochester from being happy together because they cannot be married. Rebecca, in her death, prevents the narrator and Maxim from being happy together because her presence is spelled out everywhere in the house, because the narrator is convinced that Maxim will never love her the way he loved Rebecca, and because in Rebecca, as in Jane Eyre, the master of the house is concealing a dark secret which, when it gets out, threatens to unravel everything. The narrator learns that Maxim did not actually love his first wife. He deeply despised her, and Rebecca's death was not an accidental drowning. Maxim murdered her. And 1 year after her death, her body is found, dragged out from the ocean floor, and that resurfacing of his first wife raises the possibility that Maxim will be held responsible for the crime he has committed. At the moment when Jane is about to get everything she wants, she's about to marry the man she loves, his first wife reappears and delays that happiness. At the moment when the narrator of Rebecca finally gets something she has wanted for so long, she finds out that her husband loves her in return. His first wife has resurfaced, and that threatens to delay or perhaps destroy their happiness. And in both cases, the first wife does not have a voice of her own. Much like we only had Rochester's description to go on of how Bertha went insane and why it was necessary that she gets locked up in the attic, we only have Maxim's version of the story of his marriage to Rebecca, of why their relationship was so terrible and why he killed her. He says that she had previously kept up a kind of facade with him, but once they were married, on their honeymoon, she revealed the truth of who she was, and she told him things she had done that were so horrible he will never repeat them to anyone. Which puts us in a difficult position in terms of assessing this character. We don't have concrete information. He won't give us the details about why Rebecca was so terrible. Maxim says that once Rebecca had him trapped in a marriage, once the marriage was achieved, Rebecca coerced him into an agreement where they would have a public facade of a perfect relationship, but privately she would get to live her life however she wanted. He is at least specific about saying that during their marriage, she was unfaithful to him. And so the only real conclusion to draw is that these horrible things she has done that he learns about on their honeymoon are related to some kind of non-normative sexual behavior. And maybe that sexual behavior is extramarital affairs, maybe it is casual, non-monogamous sex. Maybe on their honeymoon she told him about a history of queer sexual relationships. We don't get to know. We know very little other than the fact that Rebecca had affairs. And according to Maxim's version of events, he killed Rebecca because she provoked him into doing so by taunting him with the news that she was pregnant with another man's child. And eventually we learned that she was lying to him about this. In fact, Rebecca was dying of cancer and she wanted a quick death, even if a violent one, rather than a slow fading away. Which tells us that Rebecca knew that the best way to get Maxim to kill her was to taunt him with the idea of an interrupted patrilineal inheritance. The idea of not just having to publicly claim another man's child as his own, but of knowing that that child would inherit Manderley is what sent Maxim over the edge. So in Rebecca, as in Jane Eyre, we have a first wife whose unregulated, unbalanced, excessive behavior threatens the stability of the home. Be hidden away in private so that no one will know the truth. A first wife whose initial beauty and charm curdles into instability and danger, at least according to her husband. Neither Bertha nor Rebecca will be able to provide an heir and ensure that the ancestral home will appropriately pass to the husband's son. In Bertha's case, because she is insane, and so the only conjugal embrace Rochester will ever know is that of a violent fight. And Rebecca, because she is promiscuous. Both women antagonistic to their husband, both women deeply tied to their house. And both of the second wives, both of these poor young women without friends or family who are in love with a much older, wealthier man, are in the end only able to be with their husbands in constrained circumstances because even in death, the first wife was successful in destroying the property that she was so connected with in life. Bertha sets Thornfield on fire and dies as it burns, and Rochester is left wounded and blinded. At the end of Rebecca, Maxim gets away with murder, but Manderley burns to the ground, seemingly set on fire by the housekeeper who was loyal to Rebecca. In Jane Eyre, the ending is presented as a happy one. Jane has inherited money, so she's able to marry Rochester as an equal, and Rochester has learned his lesson. He and Jane will get to live out their lives together in a slightly less glamorous way than they previously might have, but on equal footing. In Rebecca, the ending is a much more unsettling one. The novel opens with the establishing information that Manderley has for some reason been lost, that the narrator can never go back to this place that she once considered home. And when she dreams of it, she imagines that if you walked through that property now, you would hear a woman's footsteps, you would hear the drag of a dress across the leaves. And then the novel closes with just the image of a red blaze on the skyline of Manderley burning at a distance. And so we're left, or at least I'm left, with the distinct sense that Rebecca has won. She controlled the house in her life, she haunted it in her death, and now, even though her husband has found happiness and a new wife, Rebecca has taken Manderley away from them. They can't go there anymore, but Rebecca is still there, spectrally wandering through the property. Many of the people watching this video probably know that Taylor Swift wrote a song inspired by Rebecca. The song is Tolerate It off the album Evermore, and I am going to take a little digression here to talk about a Taylor Swift song, but not that one. I want to talk a little bit about the song Madwoman. In this song, the speaker is a woman driven to anger by people who call her crazy and by living in a world that diminishes women's emotions. She, the narrating woman, is so angry that she breathes flames when she talks. And there is another woman in the song, a woman being mistreated by her husband, cheated on, written over. Swift, as the speaker, says of this woman, she should be mad, should be scathing like me. But no one likes a madwoman. There's a common thread here that stitches through an 1840s novel, a 1930s novel, a 2020s song. This idea that anger for a woman is a weapon that can cut both ways. It can empower you, but it can be used against you to discredit you. Look at her. She's crazy. Look at Rebecca and Bertha and their outbursts. They're unbalanced. They're unruly women. They are sexually desirable women who have the nerve to desire other people sexually. They're crazy. In their chapter in a book of criticism titled The Literary Taylor Swift, Ryan Kapp writes about Taylor Swift's self-narration, how Swift constructs a public image of herself through her songwriting, and how that image intentionally engages the tension between the angelic ideal and the monstrous versions of femininity. And Kapp is drawing heavily from Gilbert and Gubar in this, the madwoman as double. While acknowledging the limits to Swift's feminism and pointing out her lack of any public recognition of intersectionality, Kapp writes, "In the broadest sense, Taylor Swift's music is for people who feel things and feel them intensely. Women's emotions, both in the 19th century and now, have been dismissed as too loud, too demanding, too much. Swift has never, in all her evolutions, made her feelings the punchline of a joke." So in this reading, Swift's lyrics serve to do this work of publicly self-fashioning an identity which, regardless of your personal enjoyment of her music, undeniably resonates with a massive amount of people, and an identity that is based on the foregrounding of emotional intensity. Every time you call me crazy, I get more crazy. A madwoman is able to express her emotions, even to excess, even to the point of destruction. The madwoman gets to be intense. The madwoman gets to be inappropriate. And my final part of this little Taylor Swift digression is that in that chapter I just read from, while referencing the music critic Giselle Onyen-Nguyen, Kapp identifies that the song Madwoman is the first time in Taylor Swift's entire discography that the word fuck is used. And isn't it interesting that the first unleashing of the word fuck in a songwriter's extensive career would be through the figure, through the voice of the madwoman? That even if this is unintentional or subconscious, it's the madwoman who is able to give voice to the profane. While we're again talking around the idea of the madwoman as double, there's one more text I want to bring in that engages this idea. Charlotte Perkins Gilman, 1892, The Yellow Wallpaper. The narrator of this story is staying in a country house with her husband after she has just given birth to their first child, and she is experiencing severe postpartum depression. Of course, the characters in the story doesn't tell us that. The story tells us that she is nervous, that she can't bear to be around her baby, that she has become somewhat hysterical. And her husband is a doctor, so she defers to his instructions on how to get better. He insists that she just needs to rest, and that the place for her to rest is the bedroom in the upper floor of the house. An attic, if you will, with a bed bolted to the floor and bars on the windows, and a distinctive yellow wallpaper covering the walls. And as time goes on, and the narrator, who, like in Rebecca, doesn't have a name, continues to get worse and continues to be told by her husband that she just needs to stay in this room and rest, she becomes increasingly obsessed with this wallpaper. It has an intricate pattern on it, and she spends hour after hour just staring at it, studying the pattern until she becomes convinced that she can see it moving. She becomes convinced that the color of the wallpaper, the yellow itself, has a smell, and at one point she considers burning the house down in order to escape the smell. And eventually she realizes that there is a woman trapped behind the wallpaper, a woman who is moving around and unable to escape from the place where she is confined. Finally, the narrator begins physically tearing the paper off the walls, trying to free the woman who is trapped in this room. And when her husband manages to get into the room, she says to him, "I've got out at last." When she says this to him, she is creeping in a circle around the circumference of the room, and when he passes out in shock at what he is seeing, she just steps over him so that she doesn't have to interrupt her circuit of creeping. Again, in this story, we have a woman whose unbalanced behavior, whose deteriorating stability, is met with a husband who dismisses and controls her. Of course, whereas in Jane Eyre and Rebecca, the main character's double is an actual other woman who has gone mad, in The Yellow Wallpaper, we have madwoman and double contained within just one person. As her depression gets worse and worse, she creates this externalized version of herself, somebody who she can feel sympathy for and who she can try to free. She doesn't say to her husband, "You are trapping me, you are silencing me, you are mistreating me." Instead, she constructs this woman in the walls who she has to save. And with the story's ending, she sets the woman in the wallpaper free. She sets herself free, and at the same time, seemingly, she has a breakdown. But at least in the process of that breakdown, she gets to step on her husband. Ladies, you simply must physically trample over the men who call you crazy. So we've looked at our original madwoman in the attic. We've looked at Bertha in Jane Eyre. We've seen how this character emerges out of historical discourse and literary tradition that links women and inheritance and property, women and sex and mental instability. We see how these connections continue developing in a text like The Yellow Wallpaper, how elements of the story of Jane Eyre can be restructured and adapted in a novel like Rebecca, how the story can be critiqued and expanded in a novel like Wide Sargasso Sea, and always with that central figure of the unbalanced woman who possesses the house like a ghost. If I were killed in this house, would I too linger in an unholy way and watch the perverted fairy tale repeat itself as the gleaming prince brought a new wife home? Watch her emerge from the carriage, all shining silks and a face open with trust, only to be brought to my waiting jaws like a sacrifice? As we continue exploring these connections and tracking this figure of the madwoman in the attic across the pages of literary history, we're going to make a jump in time forward now, all the way to the 2020s. Lately, as I have been reading contemporary Gothic novels, I keep on encountering the madwoman in the attic in the pages of the books I'm reading. Sometimes the madwoman is present mostly as an influence, like in Midnight Rooms by Donyae Coles, where a young woman marries a man she doesn't know and soon afterwards finds herself trapped in a house, losing her sense of reality and losing her mind. Sometimes it's more explicit. In Hungerstone by Kat Dunn, there's a direct reference to Jane Eyre and to the madwoman figure, and there's this kind of Wollstonecraftian threat of a woman being institutionalized by her husband as a form of control. But the novel that I really want to look at and for us to spend some time thinking about is The Hacienda by Isabel Cañas. Because as I think you'll see as I start talking about the plot of this novel really falls in that literary lineage that includes Jane Eyre and Rebecca and so many others. This story takes place after the Mexican War of Independence. It's set in Mexico, and it primarily follows a character named Beatriz, who is a young woman whose family has lost everything in the war. And we enter into the book with Beatriz having just married a man named Don Rodolfo Solorzano. And she's not at all in love with Rodolfo. She's not even all that charmed by him. She's married him not for romantic reasons, but for practical ones. He has a house, an estate, and she wants it. She is just coming out of the trauma of war, the total destabilization that this caused. It led to her father being killed and her house being burnt down, and she is now without money, without power, without stability. So to her, Rodolfo's house, the Hacienda San Isidro, means security. She has learned that money and political influence and social power can come and go, but the Hacienda is stable. It will last, it will generate income, and it will give her something solid to build her life within and around. And her marriage to Rodolfo is just a pathway towards that shelter and legitimacy and stability. And when Beatriz marries Rodolfo, at first she doesn't really mind that she seems to be at least a little bit living in the shadow of the first Doña Solorzano, whose name was Maria Catalina. And she tries to overlook the, let's say, sinister vibes of the entire house. The fact that sometimes it feels to her like someone or something from within the house is watching her. The fact that none of the other women will sleep inside the main house. The laughter she keeps hearing echoing through the halls. But it doesn't take long for us to progress beyond the house just having sinister vibes. Pretty soon, the house becomes actively violent to Beatriz. And Beatriz starts to feel like the house, or something in it, is driving her crazy. It becomes clear that there is something within the house that is haunting it and kind of poisoning it and turning it malevolent, but also that The house itself is sentient, and the sentience of the house is not a problem. That in itself is not sinister or malevolent. It is being turned. The house's energy and sentience is being turned into something dark and dangerous by a different force. While we are, as I said, mostly following Beatrice's story in this novel, we switch between her perspective and the perspective of a priest, a hot priest, named Andres. Andres grew up in San Isidro, and in addition to being a priest, he is a witch. He joined the priesthood so that the kind of socially sanctioned spirituality of Christianity could serve as a cover for his ancestral practices. And at one point in the book, we get a flashback to a previous time when he returned to San Isidro after a long absence. And this was before the malevolent spirit, the dangerous energy, started to possess and poison the house. As he approaches the house, he thinks to it, "Hello, old friend." And it grumbled in reply, shifting cantankerously on its foundations. We then get these thoughts from him. "The house had more moods than a swallow had feathers. I was fond of its peevish spells. Its impatient creaks and groaning inspired an urge in me to pat its side affectionately, as I would a stubborn but lovable mule. As a child, I knew this ancient house of spirits was unlike anything I had ever seen. Now, after having stepped through the doorways of countless old houses, I knew it was unique." The house has this unique character and this personality, and in its natural state, this is its mood, kind of grumpy but lovable. Maybe grumbling, maybe shifting grumpily on its foundations, but not attacking people, which, when Beatrice is living there, is what it's doing. Invisible hands attack her when she walks through the halls alone at night. She opens a trunk of fabric and finds them soaked in blood. She's unable to sleep at night because there is a ceaseless, disembodied pounding at the door. And in addition to the laughter that she can sometimes hear in the halls, she hears this sing-song voice calling out the name Juana, which is the name of Rodolfo's sister. When she goes to Padre Andres for help, she's initially hoping that he'll perform a Christian exorcism, but he ends up having to use his abilities as a witch to try to figure out what's going on. Together, they eventually discovered that the first Doña Solorzano, Maria Catalina, did not die of natural causes. She was murdered, and her body was bricked into the walls of the house. So you can see why I say that this book is a clear descendant of Jane Eyre and Rebecca. Like in Jane Eyre, the first wife is secretly, physically trapped in the structure of the house, in this case, of course, dead rather than alive, but her presence in the house is disruptive and is causing these unexplained things, these sinister happenings that affect the life of the new young woman who lives there. And as in Rebecca, this first wife is kind of driving the new wife crazy from beyond the grave, and eventually the details of her death are going to resurface to catastrophic effect. In Rebecca, we learned that the title character, our first Mrs. De Winter, had a cruel streak. And in the Hacienda, we learned the same thing about the first Doña Solorzano. She was cruel, much more so than Rebecca. Maria Catalina was disrespectful at best and outright violent at worst to the workers and any lower-class people in San Isidro, and especially to the ones who weren't as light-skinned as her. This is one of the through lines in this book, how some of the characters' class and race are wielded against them. There is this fixation on lightness of skin, on blood purity, essentially, in the kind of Criolla high society. And both Andres and Beatriz are mestizo, and so their darker features are read negatively by some of the people around them. And this is especially true for Andres, who, in addition to being visibly darker, has these close personal ties to indigenous spiritual practices that mark him as being perceived as dangerously other by people around him. And these conversations about race and forced cultural assimilation and otherness bring us back, of course, again to Jane Eyre, to Bertha, how the houses of the wealthy are haunted by colonial harm. But this time, rather than the house being haunted by the other who falls outside the bounds of whiteness, the Hacienda is haunted by a figure who sought to maintain those lines of class and race-based hierarchies. But in both books, even if in different directions, we have the house of the wealthy haunted by colonial harm. The importance of the house and of women's relationship with the house is one of those kind of classic Gothic elements that gets brought to the foreground in the Hacienda. I talked all the way at the beginning of this video about how we see frequently in Gothic novels women tied to houses. All these connections between gender, property, domesticity, sex, woven together in Gothic narrative. This repeated question of who gets to possess a house. And as I said, Beatrice wants a house much more than she wants a husband. Marriage is just her pathway to property. And really, her husband, Udolpho, is not all that present in the book. He is absent from the story and from San Isidro itself for much of the novel. The emphasis, the story being told, is about the women connected to the house. Udolpho's sister, Juana, the housekeeper, and her daughter, Beatriz, and of course, the malevolent spirit of Maria Catalina. At first, Beatriz thinks that the spirit of Maria Catalina hates Udolpho, but it eventually becomes clear that she loves Udolpho. She's protective and possessive over Udolpho, and that Udolpho is not a good man. The whole violent backstory unwinds over the course of the novel, and we learn that Udolpho had a history of sexually assaulting the young women who worked in San Isidro, and when one of these young women became pregnant as a result of his assault of her, Maria Catalina found out, and she murdered the young girl. And partly in retaliation for this, though largely to serve her own personal interests, Udolpho's sister, Juana, then murdered Maria Catalina. Juana is a fairly unconventional woman. She's very direct, she's very brash, she is deeply involved in the logistics of running this estate connected to the Hacienda. They make their money by farming agave plants, and Juana is deeply connected, deeply involved in this, and feels a deep sense of ownership over the property. But it turns out, not only is she displaced from inheritance because she is a woman, she is also a bastard. She carries her father's name, the Solorzano name, but she is the result of an affair that her and Udolpho's mother had. So she has no legal ties, no blood ties to San Isidro. But she wants control of the house, she wants to possess it, and so she is going to take out anyone who stands in her way. And the people who stand in her way are her brother and his wives. We have this triad of women in San Isidro. We have Juana, we have Beatriz, we have Maria Catalina, all of them tied to the same man, one as his sister, two as his wives, all of them struggling for control over the house. Beatriz is the lady of the house. She is married to the patron. She has the most technical ownership over this estate, and that is exactly why she has come to it, because she wants to possess the security of this house. But she finds herself in this battle against Juana and Maria Catalina. Juana runs the estate, has no legal ownership over it, but wants it, wants to legally, literally possess it. And Maria Catalina, of course, is spiritually possessing this house and turning it against Juana and against Beatriz. And each of these three women tied to this house have an element of madness about them. Maria Catalina, of course, is this vengeful spirit in the house, both acting outside the bounds of sanity herself and also driving other people outside the bounds of sanity. Juana is perhaps not insane, although there is an argument to be made for the fact that committing a series of murders is not a mentally stable thing to do. She is also frequently drunk, which puts her acting outside of that conventional polite behavior for a woman and outside of mentally stable normative behavior. And Beatrice, of course, is being kind of systematically driven insane by both of these women. Maria Catalina is tormenting her, keeping her from sleeping, keeping her from ever relaxing. And all the while, Juana is gaslighting and manipulating Beatrice, making her think that she is imagining these things, that she is a madwoman. Eventually, in her attempt to gain the full possession, the ownership of the house, Juana kills Udolpho and frames Beatrice. And when Beatrice is being held within San Isidro, awaiting either sentencing or institutionalization, Juana tries to kill her by burning the house down with her inside. The classic ending, the house must burn. So we have in this story the importance of property to a woman. We have a focus on inheritance and bloodlines and possession. Maria Catalina murdering the woman who bears her husband's bastard child. Juana, the bastard child of the previous patron of the estate, murdering those who stand in her way because she feels that she is owed ownership of the estate. Beatrice seeing marriage as a pathway to ownership of a property that will give her stability and freedom. The first wife as a threatening specter, a woman's madness being exploited by patriarchal systems, a house that is poisonous and malevolent and harming those who live within it. It's so many of these classic Gothic elements, but combined in a new way, set forward in a new context to tell a fresh story, building out this continued lineage of stories about women and madness and houses. Mary Wollstonecraft writes about an unhappy wife wrongfully institutionalized by her husband. Charlotte Bronte creates Bertha, a woman born in Jamaica and brought to England to be locked in a windowless attic room for a decade until finally escaping and setting fire to the house. Jean Rhys reimagines Bertha's madness as created through trauma rather than inherited from family. Daphne du Maurier presents a young woman with no name of her own, losing her sense of identity and reality as she becomes increasingly obsessed with her husband's first wife, whose presence haunts the house she now lives in. Charlotte Perkins Gilman explores the mental deterioration of a woman who is trapped in a room, trapped in her body, trapped within her own depression, and just clawing at the walls to let something out. Isabel Cañas imbues the house itself with madness and with a disordered violence that is destroying all of the women who live within it. Property, madness, women on the page, and women writing all of this into being. When we were talking about madness earlier in this video, I highlighted the 19th century perspective that a woman's sanity requires balance, and that reading and education were seen as things that could be unbalancing, overstimulating, that could lead a woman to madness. Women's education has to be limited, otherwise their brains will overheat and their wombs will go whizzing around their body like a bird trapped in a glass conservatory. What is a woman writer to do in a culture like that? Maybe, like Mary Wollstonecraft, you write a treatise on a woman's right to education. Maybe, like Charlotte Bronte, you publish under a male pseudonym. You find a way to assert your voice and to carve out a space for your story. Gilbert and Gubar's Madwoman in the Attic opens with the authors telling the story of how this project came to be in the first place. Both in life and in art, we saw the artists we studied were literally and figuratively confined, enclosed in the architecture of an overwhelmingly male-dominated society. These literary women were also, inevitably, trapped in the specifically literary constructs of what Gertrude Stein was to call patriarchal poetry. For not only did a 19th century woman writer have to inhabit ancestral mansions or cottages owned and built by men, she was also constricted and restricted by the palaces of art and houses of fiction male writers authored. The Madwoman in the Attic isn't just a character in the pages of the novel. She is the woman who writes the novel. She is the author bumping up against the enclosing walls of the canon. A woman within a structure that was not built with any expectation that she might be able to possess it. Influential literary critic and my personal enemy, Harold Bloom, wrote a book called The Anxiety of Influence, about how when an author is deeply influenced by those who came before him, and the pronoun is no coincidence, he runs the risk of producing only derivative work, of being so influenced by the greats who came before him that he is not able to create something truly new. Branching off of that, Gilbert and Gubar suggest an anxiety of authorship for the woman writer. The woman writer looks to the great authors before her, and if she sees only men, if she lives in a culture that tells her that she cannot produce great work, she is seized by an anxiety, a fear that she cannot truly be an author. And Gilbert and Gubar suggest that the woman writer processes this anxiety of authorship by seeking out a literary ancestor to legitimize herself and redefine herself in connection with a writer who came before. We end up with this lineage, this literary tradition, this ongoing conversation, this archive of our own, of women writing about women, women writing about the world, women writing about themselves. Earlier, I referenced real women who were wrongfully institutionalized by men, labeled as insane, and locked in asylums, even though there was no cause to do so. I didn't mention that every one of those women went on to write about their experience. Rosina Bulwer-Lytton published A Blighted Life in 1880. Hercule Roy published Memoirs d'une Aliénée, Memoirs of a Madwoman, in 1883. Georgina Weldon published The History of My Orphanage, or The Outpourings of an Alleged Lunatic and How I Escaped the Mad Doctors, in 1882. There's power in authorship. There's power in narrating your own experiences. Maybe that's part of the power of Jane Eyre, which is written in the first person and which bears the full title, Jane Eyre, an Autobiography. There may be a love story in Jane Eyre, but this is not a novel about falling in love. This is a novel about growing up, about coming into ownership of your own identity, coming into independence. This is a book about a woman narrating the events of her life. I'm going to bring us back into Jane Eyre, back to the moment when Jane is standing on the battlements of Thornfield, looking out at the world around her and feeling rebellious. The moment when she says, "Nobody knows how many rebellions besides political rebellions ferment in the masses of life which people earth. Women are supposed to be very calm generally, but women feel just as men feel." In her extended essay, A Room of One's Own, Virginia Woolf writes about that passage specifically at some length. A Room of One's Own was first published in 1929, and it's based on lectures Woolf gave at women's colleges. And for a substantial part of this essay, Woolf is kind of flipping through an archive of seminal women writers, including Charlotte Bronte, about whom she has some mixed feelings. She doesn't like that passage from Jane Eyre, in part because she feels that in it, Bronte is writing in a rage where she should write calmly. But Woolf does still have sympathy for Charlotte's situations, for her constraints, and the way that her constrained situation as a writer mirrors Jane's in that moment. She, Charlotte Bronte, knew how enormously her genius would have profited if it had not spent itself in solitary visions over distant fields, if experience and intercourse and travel had been granted her. But they were not granted, they were withheld, and we must accept the fact that all those good novels, Villette, Emma, Wuthering Heights, Middlemarch, were written by women without more experience of life than could enter the house of a respectable clergyman, written, too, in the common sitting room of that respectable house, and by women so poor that they could not afford to buy more than a few quires of paper at a time upon which to write Wuthering Heights or Jane Eyre. Woolf writes about how Charlotte Bronte and all the Brontes and many other women writers were constrained by their circumstances, by their limited access to education and to experience and to money. In talking about what is necessary in order for women to be able to produce brilliant writing freely, to be able to write works of great genius, Virginia Woolf's argument is very practical. Intellectual freedom, she says, depends upon material things. Poetry depends upon intellectual freedom. This is why Woolf says so famously, A woman must have money and a room of her own if she is to write fiction. She needs to have a financial cushion, and she needs to have a space that is hers. She needs a room over which she has mastery and within which she has privacy. It's all very nice and very capital R romantic to talk about intellectual freedom and artistic goals, but you need money and a roof over your head if you're to write any great poetry, Woolf says. And historically, Woolf is saying women have been barred from having access to money and a room of their own, to having those practical, material things that make the production of great poetry possible. But at the time that she's writing, in the 1920s, she thinks things are on their way towards improving. And there is a bit of a flaw or a blind spot maybe in how Virginia Woolf is talking about the conditions necessary to produce great writing. She's operating based on the idea that great literature can't come from someone living in poverty, which of course we know is not true. In talking about this blind spot in Virginia Woolf's premise, the author Alice Walker points to the writer Phillis Wheatley, who lived and wrote in the 1700s, when not only did she not have money or a room of her own, she did not have legal personhood. Phillis Wheatley was enslaved when she published her first book of poetry. It's a good point, although unfortunately Alice Walker does defend J.K. Rowling and believes conspiracies about lizard people. Of course, it is much, much harder to achieve success of any kind when you have systemic limitations upon you, when you have systemic obstacles in your way. And it's hard to think about producing poetry when you have to think about putting food on the table, when you have no money of your own, no space of your own. And every writer does deserve access to money and a room of their own. Every person deserves money and a room of their own. But of course you can produce, and many people have produced great art even without income and privacy. Oftentimes when we are reading works of literature or scholarship that constituted groundbreaking feminism in their own time, there are passages and ideas that are exciting and that feel fresh and that feel remarkably current. And then there will be passages and ideas that are outdated, that fall flat, that reinforce some things that we now see as regressive or harmful or even just incomplete. And it's a good thing when we notice those texts are outdated. That means we've moved beyond it. We've progressed further. We get to look back over the writers who came before us, just like Gilbert and Gubar and Virginia Woolf are looking back over previous writers, engaging with these traditions of women writers, keeping that conversation going. What does it mean to be a woman writer in a culture whose fundamental definitions of literary authority are both overtly and covertly patriarchal? I introduced myself at the beginning of this video as your madwoman in the attic, and this is how I've been describing myself in videos for years now. This has been how I identify myself on social media platforms. And that's partly just because it is a factually accurate description. I am a woman living in an attic apartment where I sometimes feel like I'm losing my mind. I have had multiple emotional breakdowns in this very room. This is the room where I have written multiple drafts of novels that will never see the light of day. This is the room where I wrote my entire doctoral dissertation. This really is my room of my own. You know, this is the place where I work, I write, I read, I talk through my thoughts about literature. I've been working on this video for months now, and really the more I worked on it, the more I started to realize that this is something I've been kind of indirectly researching and reading around for many years. As I was writing up my notes on this madwoman in the attic figure, I just kept on being reminded of more and more texts that I had read, and I just kept on being able to walk over to my bookshelves and pull off a book that was relevant to what I was thinking about. I've been doing research to kind of fill in the gaps of what I've read and shade in some more detail around the historical context and the scholarly perspectives on these subjects, but the literature was just all around me. Jane Eyre, of course, and the Yellow Wallpaper Wallpaper. I started doing my research and writing up my notes on the history of institutionalization, and it reminded me of Maria or the Wrongs of Woman, a copy of which I had bought something like 7 years ago for a grad seminar. I realized that I wanted to talk about Virginia Woolf, and I don't even know where I got this copy or when it was. It was at least a decade ago, but there it was on my shelf. Rebecca, Midnight Rooms, Hungerstone, The Hacienda. These were all books that I had purchased last fall when I was planning this personal curriculum in Gothic literature that I wanted to do in order to deepen my understanding of a genre that I already had a casual love for. More and more, I just kept seeing all of these through lines of madness and property and frustration under controlling circumstances and women narrating their own life stories in the books that I was reading and the music I was listening to and in the narratives I was watching in film and television. It's like the scene in Tangled where Rapunzel looks around her and realizes that she's been painting the same pattern over and over and over again onto her walls without realizing it, just repeating this same pattern, surrounding herself with this same thing. The Madwoman has been on my shelves and in my attic and in my brain all along. In some ways, I didn't actually want to make this video because I didn't want to end the part where I'm writing notes and researching and gathering connections and move to the part where I structure things and I put a beginning and an end onto this. And really, I don't feel like I can end this in any kind of declarative, conclusive way. And I don't want to. I don't want to say, this is what I think the Madwoman is. This is the function of the Madwoman in the attic in Gothic narrative. Sometimes the Madwoman is this double, this uninhibited figure able to enact all of the excesses of emotions that the polite, well-balanced woman can't. Sometimes she is this figure of threatening, unrestrained sexual agency. Sometimes she serves as this haunting reminder of colonial violence lurking in the upper-class home. Sometimes she's not mad at all. She's just a woman who has been locked away. And really, she can be all these things and more within one text, depending on the exact lens you're looking through, the exact perspective you're coming to the story with. The Madwoman is this haunting figure present in so many pieces of literature, so many ongoing conversations, and she's an ambiguous presence, and that ambiguity, I think, is what makes this such a rich and compelling topic to discuss. And much like there's not a definitive answer on what the significance of the Madwoman in the attic is, what this figure means, I don't think that there's one single neat evolution of the figure, one trajectory that we can track across the evolution of the Gothic genre. But there is a bit of a progression that I see when I look back over these hundreds of years worth of literature and history, when I look back over all of the texts that I have been reading about this topic. And that is that from the 18th century to the 21st, over time, more and more, the Madwoman is able to speak for herself, both in terms of the writer, in that sense that Gilbert and Gubar talk about of how the woman writer is like the Madwoman in the attic, confined within the patriarchal structure. More and more over time, of course, women are able to write freely. We have come a long way from Mary Wollstonecraft insisting that women deserve education, and Charlotte Bronte publishing under a male pseudonym, and Virginia Woolf opening a room of one's own with an anecdote about how she was denied access to a library because she didn't have a man with her. But also in terms of the woman on the page, the Madwoman in the attic literary figure. From that first Madwoman in the attic in the pages of Jane Eyre, published 1847, we get more and more authors who are imbuing the Madwoman with real interiority and real personhood. We get writers like Rhys and Isabel Cañas who bring us into the mind, into the perspective of the Madwoman in the attic, give her complexity, give her motivation, give her a voice. And I want to close out with that original Madwoman in the attic. I want to go back into Bertha and take a look at her final moments. At no point is Bertha given the opportunity to speak or even really acknowledged to have the ability to speak. She doesn't deliver words. She doesn't express through language what she feels, but she is deeply expressive. And in her final moments, we see her expressing herself and using her voice. Through Jane, we hear secondhand the story of what happened to Bertha. Jane has returned to the area surrounding Thornfield because she has had this premonition, this sense that Mr. Rochester needs her. And she's speaking to somebody who lives in the area, who knows what happened, and who can tell her about how Thornfield burnt down. This man explains that one night Bertha was able to sneak out of her room. She first set fire to the attic, and then she set fire to the bed where Jane used to sleep. The entire house went up in flames, and Mr. Rochester was trying to get everyone out, including Bertha, and somebody called out to him that she was on the roof, where she was standing, waving her arms above the battlements and shouting out till they could hear her a mile off. I saw her and heard her with my own eyes. She was a big woman and had long black hair. We could see it streaming against the flames as she stood. I witnessed, and several more witnessed, Mr. Rochester ascend through the skylight onto the roof. We heard him call, Bertha. We saw him approach her. And then, ma'am, she yelled and gave a spring. She sets fire to her room and to Jane's room, and she climbs up on the top of her burning prison, and in her last moment, she jumps away from Mr. Rochester, and in doing so, she dies. That moment right before Bertha leaps is the image of the madwoman that I want us to end with. That image of Bertha standing on the battlements, surrounded by fire, and shouting. We still don't get to hear any words that she might have to express what she feels. She isn't given language or dialogue, but that final moment is her using her voice and using it so loudly, so assertively that anyone for a mile around will have to hear her.